First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, although I'm not an expert in free will or neuroscience, so this will be an adventure. But what I do have some knowledge about is philosophy of imagination, which I'm at the moment writing my thesis about. So I will kind of approach the topic from the perspective of imagination. And I will do it with the help of Charles Sanders Peirce. To understand Peirce's writing, it is important not to forget that his philosophy was part of a more general semiotic theory, according to which the world of appearances consists entirely of signs. In relation to the sign and the signified object, the sign user is engaged in an open-ended and endless process of interpretation. Peirce's semiotics influenced his development of an evolutionary cosmology, according to which everything in the world of appearances evolves. In fact, he conceived the entire universe as an evolutionary product, where even the habits of nature, or what we typically refer to as natural laws, have themselves evolved. The term habit is, by Peirce, as well as other philosophers of the pragmatic school, used to designate a variety of different things: beliefs, logical principles, instincts, dispositions, instincts, and so on. Further, a habit doesn't have so much to do with repetitive actions and routines as with being a readiness to act in a certain way under certain circumstances and when actuated by a given motive and habit. When the practical consequences of our habitual actions becomes inconsistent, doubt arises, and the process of inquiry thus begins. Of relevance for our upcoming discussion on abductive imagination is the fact that Peirce didn't consider nature to be static. On the contrary, he emphasized that certain aspects of the world, for example, human thoughts and imagination, were outside the grasp of natural laws. These habits of the world were, he thought, better understood as constantly evolving and spontaneously changing. In order to reduce doubt and return to a stable belief habit, individuals engage in processes of inquiry. Peirce examined three fundamental modes of reasoning that play a role in inquiry, commonly known as abductive, deductive, and inductive inference. Abduction may be described as the act of making up explanatory hypotheses. The role of deduction is to derive testable consequences from the explanatory hypothesis conceived by abduction. Induction, in turn, makes a verdict on the hypothesis. Imagination, in Peirce's view, plays a key role in abductive inference. He writes, "When a man desires ardently to know the truth, his first effort will be to imagine what the truth can be. There is, after all, nothing but imagination that can ever supply him an inkling of the truth. He can stare stupidly at phenomena, but in the absence of imagination, they will not connect themselves together in any rational way." According to Peirce, abduction is the only type of inference from which novel ideas are created. The abductive judgment is described as a flash, an act of insight, although of extremely valuable insight. In his later writings, Peirce also saw it in relation to a certain kind of guessing instinct. What he had in mind was, however, not cases of pure chance, but rather a specific kind of instinct that makes us good, although not infallible, at finding true hypotheses. At the same time, he continued to consider abduction to be part of the logic of science. The view that hypotheses are produced both by insight and inference has caused some interpreters to describe it as paradoxical. Other scholars, nonetheless, claim that the seemingly contrasting qualities of control and free play should rather be viewed as complementary characteristics of the abductive process as such. One thing that I want you to remember from this part of the presentation is Peirce's view that the pattern of abduction, deduction, and induction is paradigmatic of all human inquiry. From this perspective, abductive inference as a combination of free play and rational reasoning becomes a crucial step towards belief formation. Of particular interest is Peirce's understanding of the universe as a semiotic system where the sign user is engaged in an endless process of sign interpretation. He developed a view which he called tychism, and according to this position, indeterminism, or absolute chance, is a real factor operative in the universe. From emphasizing the spontaneous characteristics of thought, Peirce now started looking for spontaneity as it was manifested in the world. This was, so to speak, a search for continuity between human inquiry and the natural sphere, and between mind and matter. However, in Peirce's view, spontaneity existed side by side with law and necessity. He thus wanted to accommodate chance and determinability and find a way to articulate continuity between the two. However, there is no single conception of imagination in play in contemporary philosophy. In fact, since imagination is viewed as performing such a variety of functions, it is sometimes questioned if it really can be understood as a single faculty at all. However, there are at least 2 points on which most scholars would agree. 1, imagination is a cognitive state or a group of states, irreducible to other mental state types, like belief and memory, although it shares some characteristics with them. And 2, in contrast to representational states such as, could I please get a glass of water or something? Would be really great. In contrast to representational states such as perception and belief, imagination, thank you so much. In contrast to representational states such as perception and belief, imagination doesn't have the same critical relation to truth. And since it isn't truth-bound, imagination doesn't function to accurately represent the world as it is, and consequently doesn't aim for objectivity. This, in turn, gives imagination a freedom that most other attitudes or capacities lack. The terms imagination and creativity is often used interchangeably. In this presentation, I will, however, follow Dustin Stokes' suggestion that imagination is important even for the most minimally creative thought processes. According to his thesis, creative thought and behavior requires cognitive manipulation. This manipulation involves voluntary thinking about the contents of some conceptual space in non-truth-bound ways. And according to Stokes, imagination is the best candidate for serving the cognitive manipulation role. Besides cognitive playfulness, imagination is referred to as being voluntary. One generally can control one's imagination at will, while one does not, with any immediacy, decide to believe. Similarly, there is a significant freedom in how to use and direct the imagination. I can, for example, use it in a playful way, engaging effective systems, or in a more constrained way, making suppositions only as robust as is needed for hypothesis generation. Creativity, on the other hand, is characterized by A, novelty in relation to some comparison class, B, that the novelty is considered valuable, and C, agency. The last mentioned criteria consequently means that creative thoughts and behaviors are ones for which we are responsible. In this perspective, cloud figures cannot be creative, no matter how interesting they may be. The connection between imagination and creativity becomes evident, for instance, in features like free association. That is, insights that result from some kind of subconscious or implicit cognition, sometimes referred to as incubation. The most well-known characterization is probably given in the story about how Auguste Kekulé discovered the benzene molecule, although there's a lot of myths about that, but that's probably the most famous case. When allowing different ideas and concepts combine, without active direction and correction, Kekulé made his creative breakthrough. When comparing imagination and creativity to each other, it seems that imagination doesn't have the same close relation to responsibility as creativity does. The general view is that we are not responsible for having imaginings, but rather for how we act upon them. I will come back to this factor in the last segment of the presentation, when I discuss the connection between imagination and free will. Research on neuroscience and imagination can focus on different aspects of the phenomena in question. Some studies are, for example, concerned with the neurobiological foundation of specific facets of imagination, like, for example, mental imagery, often referring to the difference between imagination and perception. Other researchers compare commonalities with other underlying information processing mechanisms like autobiographical and episodic memory, prospection, self-referential thinking, or mind reading. That is, making inferences what someone else is thinking about. In a recently published article, Anna Abraham stresses the need for synthesizing the findings across these different domains of imagination. Her research, I think, is very interesting and brave, one must admit, since she tries to do something that scholars haven't been able to find a proper solution to since during the more than 2,300 years that has passed since Plato and Aristotle did their initial reflections on the topic of imagination. That is, what she tries to do is to make a serious attempt to find out the relation between the different forms of imagination and, as in Abraham's case, to relate it to neuroscientific research. Considering the time limit, I won't be able to go into depth of Abraham's research, but I also want to show two slides that in some way summarizes some of her central ideas. In the first slide, Anna Abraham makes a classification of operations relevant to the human imagination. They are categorized on the basis of similarities in their underlying putative neurocognitive mechanism. And we can come back to that, but I will skip through quite fast. The second slide gives a generalized summary of the neurocognitive basis of each of the 5 categories of the imagination. A study I will recapitulate more thoroughly, though, is an article by Agnati et al. From 2013. I sympathize with the approach of this study, since the authors doesn't aim at locating the imaginative capacity at a particular part of the brain or parts. On the contrary, they suggest that a possible mechanism for the emergence of imagination could be found in the interaction between a multiplicity of functional models in the brain. The authors argue for the existence of an imaginary neuron system, or INS. This system can be understood in the context of a redeployment hypothesis and interaction-dominant dynamics among different functional modules of the brain. That is, according to these researchers, behaviors isn't the product of rigidly delineated architectural modules, each having predetermined functions. On the contrary, Agnati and his co-authors states that the modules communicate and collaborate with each other so that their processes becomes coordinated and integrative. Neural structures and brain areas can thus be redeployed or reused for new functions, giving rise to, for example, imagery and imagination. The massive redeployment of local networks to different higher-level cognitive tasks is carried out under control of the default mode network, the authors propose. At the same time, it is suggested that the imagination process involves mechanisms that mediate concurrent activation and deactivation of three large-scale brainworks, namely the default mode network, the central executive network, and the salience network. In this process, mirror neurons and another special called neurons, GWENs, are reduced within the imagery neuron system. They may, however, also be redeployed for other functions, for example, emotional behavior. And this is the model that they suggest. And this model shows how the cognitive control mechanisms that mediate concurrent activation and deactivation of three large-scale brain networks, namely the default mode network, the central executive network, and the salience network during task performance or during imagination processes. And now to a conclusion. Let's suppose that Charles Sanders Peirce was right in claiming that abductive imagination plays a crucial role in all forms of human inquiries. That is, we can stare stupidly at phenomena, but in the absence of imagination, they will not connect themselves together in any rational way. Recent studies hypothesizing about the neurobiological foundation of imagination point to a complex interrelation between different brain networks and functional modules. This resembles in many ways Peirce's own understanding of the habits of the world as constantly evolving and spontaneously changing. At the same time, he conceived spontaneity to exist side by side with law and necessity. Imagination is, according to a common view, a mental state type that is not truth-bound. This gives it, in turn, a certain freedom. We may, however, have to ask what kind of freedom we are referring to here. When it comes to free will, we often associate it with an ability to make undetermined choices between a set of different alternatives. Consequently, free will is closely related to agency and responsibility for the choices that one has made. But while responsibility is said to be related to creativity, the same isn't the case with imaginings. That is, before a person acts upon what he or she has imagined. In fact, non-truth boundness in connection to a certain kind of, what should we call it, anarchistic and uncensored tendency may even be a prerequisite for the perspective-changing role that imagination plays in a variety of cognitive situations. In fact, perhaps one can even say that imagination is a prerequisite for free will itself, since it enables us to conceive of possible alternatives instead of just one single determined outcome. Imaginative freedom, nonetheless, has its limitations. Thomas B. Ward's work on structured imagination indicates, for example, that human imagination is constrained by prior perceptual knowledge. That is, when individuals create a new member in a known category, their imagination is structured by properties that are characteristic for this category. That is, even when the participants in Ward's study were invited to imagine animals that might live on a planet somewhere else in the galaxy, the majority of the imagined creature were structured by properties that are typical of animals on Earth. And with this, I will end. Thank you for your attention.